This is a new series that I'm going to be trying out called Autism 101. So there's a major lacking on the college and university level when it comes to autism education. Many counselors in today's society work with autistics, and they don't really understand that there's a different way of working with an autistic individual. Because our graduate and undergraduate schools didn't prepare us for working with autistic individuals. Essentially, at the graduate level, at the master's level, they simply focus on passing the National Counseling Examination. At the undergraduate level, though, there are things that could be taught. There are classes that could be given on neurodivergence in general, but specifically autism. I believe there's enough material out there to fill up an entire semester or quarter, however your college has it laid out, of classes specifically just around autism. So that's what this course, this video series is going to be essentially focusing on, educating at the academic level on autism. At the end of this, I will be providing references. As I said, this is academic level material to be able to provide this course for each and every one of you who hopes to either work with autistics, either in the counseling field or in education, or maybe you're just a parent who wants to learn more about their autistic child. So what is autism? Autism spectrum disorder is a neurodevelopmental disability characterized by deficits in social communication and restrictive, repetitive behaviors and interests. Autism is divided into 3 levels of support needs. Level 1, or as the DSM says, requiring support, how most autistics, at least adult autistics, prefer to identify it as being low support. So level 1 is requiring support or low support. Level 2 is requiring substantial support or moderate support. Level 3 is requiring very substantial support or high support. As you can see, autism is not divided into functioning levels, but rather than support needs. Autism is a spectrum. It's not linear. You can't be more or less autistic. It's a series of traits. Soon we'll get into the slide that talks a little bit more about that. Autism can and generally does co-occur alongside a number of other conditions. This will be touched upon later. It was introduced as autism or autistic disorder in the DSM-3, which came out in 1980. Asperger's syndrome was included in the DSM-4, which was released in 1994. And then in 2013, with the release of the DSM-5, autism spectrum disorder combined autistic disorder, Asperger's syndrome, childhood disintegrative disorder, pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, and Rett syndrome. So let's go ahead and talk about the support needs levels. Support levels for autistics aren't about high functioning and low functioning, as I stated earlier. The levels of support needs are separated into 2 categories: restricted repetitive behaviors and interests, and social communication. You can need more support in one of those categories and less support in the other, or flip between the 2. Support levels are not constant. Autistics will commonly move between support needs throughout their life, often even throughout the day. This kind of revolves around spoon theory, which was created by Christine Miserandino in 2003 in an essay she entitled Spoon Theory. What spoon theory is everybody begins each day with a certain amount of energy, or in this case, spoons. For an holistic person, somebody without a disability, it could cost 1 spoon to wake up, get out of bed, go to the bathroom, brush your teeth, comb your hair, go to the kitchen, eat breakfast, get dressed, and then go to work. That could all cost 1 spoon. By the end of the day, the holistic individual or the non-disabled individual will still have spoons left over. And in many cases, sometimes those spoons will even transfer over to the next day for an holistic person or a non-disabled person. For a disabled person, such as the case with autism, it could cost a person 1 spoon just to get up and go to the bathroom. Then another one to brush their teeth and hair, another one to eat breakfast, get dressed, so on. By the end of the day, many autistics are completely depleted of spoons. Sometimes they even go into the negative, using up spoons they don't even have. And that actually carries over to the next day, which means the next day the autistic or disabled individual is starting with fewer spoons than they had the day before. Now, spoons aren't all the same size when it comes to spoon theory. You can have big spoons and small spoons. The big spoons would be like you have enough energy to wash the dishes, a sink full of dishes. Then there's a little spoon. You have enough energy to wash one dish. And so by the weekend, what happens is the disabled individual, such as the case with autism, will be completely drained of their spoons, often ending the week in a negative. And so they have to spend the entire weekend replenishing those spoons, which often means they do absolutely nothing all weekend. They lay in bed and watch TV, or they just lay in bed and sleep, or they just lounge around. It may seem like they're being lazy, but they really aren't. They just don't have the energy. Continuing on, oftentimes you'll hear people refer to profound autism. First of all, let me just say profound autism isn't a diagnosis. It's not real. It doesn't exist. The term was introduced into the DSM-1, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, first edition, in 1952. It wasn't a diagnosis at the time. It was merely considered a trait of childhood schizophrenia. With the eventual releases of further editions of the DSM, such as the DSM-2, 3, 4, and 5, the term profound autism was completely left out. It didn't show up again until the Lancet Commission proposed the term in 2021 to describe those most disabled by autism. If the Lancet Commission sounds familiar to you, this is the publication that actually published Andrew Wakefield's fraudulent study on vaccines causing autism in 1998. It was found that Andrew Wakefield, a medical doctor, I believe in Britain, because that's where the Lancet is, it's a British publication, did very poor science when it came to this study. His population was very, very small, and in many instances, he completely fabricated information. The Lancet didn't actually retract Wakefield's study until 12 years later. That's 12 years worth of false information, 12 years worth of media coverage saying that vaccines cause autism, which further studies by different researchers have all concluded vaccines do not cause autism. In fact, what actually happens is that the act of giving a vaccine, the shot itself, is a traumatic experience for the child. It's given between the ages of 12 and 18 months, which, according to Erik Erikson, is the stage of development called trust versus mistrust. So this traumatic experience of actually giving a shot, which oftentimes for an adult can be painful. It can feel like you're getting punched in the arm and sometimes even burns slightly. For an infant, it can be incredibly traumatic. And autistics commonly consider all traumas the same. Whether it be big T traumas or little t traumas, they're all considered the same for an autistic individual. A big T trauma would be something like witnessing a murder or being involved in a fire or a car accident or something like that. A little T trauma would be getting yelled at, getting punched, getting in trouble, stuff like that. Well, for an autistic individual, they're all the same. It's all big T trauma. The nervous system and the mind can't distinguish between the two. So what happens is the act of actually giving the vaccine, the shot itself, is so traumatic for the infant that their autistic traits are forced to manifest essentially. They aren't coming out of nowhere. The child is already born as autistic. It's just that trauma makes those traits more prominent. It actually causes the infant to exhibit the traits, the autistic traits. Because prior to this, they didn't have any demands. They didn't have any traumas, so to speak, other than actually being born, which, most people don't remember. It's called infantile amnesia. But the actual act of getting that shot forges trauma inside the infant. And while they may not actually remember the shot, they remember the experience. And it sends their nervous system into overdrive. They're processing into overdrive. They learn they cannot trust the world because the world just hurt them. So when the Lancet proposed this definition for profound autism at the International Society for Autism Research, they said it needed to meet certain criteria, that it had to meet the diagnostic criteria for autism, that the individual is at least 8 years old, acknowledging that some characteristics consistent with profound autism are evident earlier, requires adult supervision exceeding age-appropriate levels to ensure physical and mental health, safety, and well-being due to risks of elopement, injury, or lack of environmental awareness, demonstrates adaptive functioning skills significantly below age level with an inability to independently perform most activities of daily living. That the individual meets one of two of the following criteria. A, has severely impaired cognitive abilities reflected by IQ under 50, and or B, generally does not verbally communicate other than single words or fixed phrases and communicated predominantly only to have their basic needs met. These characteristics are neither intermittent nor transient and persistent across different environmental settings and situations. So there seems to be a number of problems with this definition. It proposes that autism can be linear, more or less autistic, opposed to a spectrum. Most, if not all, actual diagnoses require differential diagnosis. This is the possibility that the diagnosis could be something else, that it may not actually be autism, that it could be some other disorder. But the definition of profound autism doesn't provide a differential diagnosis at all. It also implies that these traits are caused by autism itself rather than another secondary diagnosis. Such secondary diagnoses could be intellectual developmental disorder, global developmental delay, unspecified intellectual developmental disorder, language disorder, speech sound disorder, childhood onset fluency disorder, social pragmatic communication disorder, unspecified communication disorder, specific learning disorder. As you can see, each and every one of those differential diagnoses explains the criteria or the definition proposed by the Lancet for profound autism. Because autism doesn't actually cause an intellectual disability. It doesn't cause deficits in intelligence. So as stated before, autism is a spectrum. It's a combination of unique characteristics, social communication, and restrictive and or repetitive behaviors and interests. For social communication, someone like myself, who is an adult late diagnosed autistic, I often have trouble verbalizing. It's difficult for me to process what I want to say, how I want to say it, and so on. It also requires me to process what other people are saying at a slower rate. So it may take me longer if I don't have a script prepared, if I don't know the questions in advance to respond. So oftentimes I end up just agreeing because it takes me longer to process, which is the social communication aspect. And this is notable for many autistic adults, even autistic children and adolescents as well. As for the restrictive and or repetitive behaviors and interests, things like arm flapping, T-Rex arms, walking tiptoed all the time, dancing around, fidgeting, collecting objects, special interests, stuff like that would count towards this. As you can see on the spectrum on the side, many of these spectrums will look slightly different. Some of them will have different labels. On this one you have aggression, depression, which according to this one would be moderately low, maybe middle of the road, whereas fixations would be relatively high. Abnormal or flat speech would be similar to aggression and depression. Then noise sensitivity would be relatively high. Same with social difficulty. Anxiety would be low. Abnormal posture would be really high. Poor eye contact would be low. Tics and fidgets would be relatively high. Now, looking at this, these aren't entirely autistic traits. These are just some stereotypical autistic traits. Many autistics experience anxiety and depression. We also experience aggression, especially when we're in burnout or meltdown. Fixations such as special interests or collections, abnormal or flat speech, stuff like what I mentioned with the social communications that I have trouble with. Noise sensitivity. A lot of autistics experience this noise sensitivity. So you'll see many of us wearing headphones in public. It can be very overwhelming. Social difficulty this kind of goes back to the abnormal flat speech part as well. That was really divided into two sections for this spectrum. It's also commonly believed that autistics express poor eye contact or can't look people in the eyes. That's actually wrong. In many cases, including my own case, we can look people in the eyes. It's just very uncomfortable for us. For me, when I look somebody in the eyes, if their line of sight is directed elsewhere, I can look them in the eyes as long as I want to. But the moment their line of sight makes contact with my eyes, it is very uncomfortable and I immediately have to look away. So these characteristics can change over time and from situation to situation. They may not be noticeable in a person due to masking. Masking is when somebody essentially tries to hide their autistic traits to appear more or less allistic, which is non-autistic, in order to fit in with society, to fit in with their peer groups, to be accepted. So autism is not a learning disability, as mentioned earlier, nor is it a mental health condition, but they can co-occur. Instead, autism is a neurodevelopmental disability. Our brains just develop differently than neurotypicals. What actually happens is during synaptic pruning, which happens during development throughout adolescence, childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood, our neurotransmitters do not actually prune the way many allistics do. So we still have the same number of neurotransmitters that we had in childhood. Well, some will prune, but not as many as an allistic person's. So the diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorder is a persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts as manifested by all of the following currently or by history. What that means is the person is either experiencing or exhibiting these traits now, or they did in childhood. They had to exhibit them in childhood in order to receive a diagnosis, actually. But if they only express them in childhood, but they no longer do, it's likely due to masking. They learned how to adapt in order to better fit in. But it has to be present in childhood. So deficits in social emotional reciprocity, ranging, for example, from abnormal social approach and failure of normal back and forth conversation, to reduced sharing of interests, emotions, or affect, to failure to initiate or respond to social interactions. Deficits in nonverbal communicative behaviors used for social interaction, ranging, for example, from poorly integrated verbal and nonverbal communication to abnormalities in eye contact and body language, or deficits in understanding and use of gestures to a total lack of facial expressions and nonverbal communication. Deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships, ranging, for example, from difficulties adjusting behavior to suit various social contexts to difficulties in sharing imaginative play or in making friends to absence of interest in peers. Now, this isn't accumulative. They don't have to experience every single one of these traits exactly how it's written here. Much of this is up to interpretation. And while some autistics may be capable of imaginative play with their friends, they may still have struggles with making and keeping friends. Sometimes an autistic person will experience all of these deficits. Other times they may only exhibit a few from each of the sections, 1, 2, or 3. But they do have to at least exhibit some from all 3 of these. So restrictive repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities as manifested by at least 2 of the following, currently or by history. Stereotyped or repetitive motor movements, use of objects or speech. Insistence on sameness, inflexible adherence to routines or ritualized patterns of verbal or nonverbal behavior. Highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus. Hyper or hyporeactivity to sensory input or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. This can look like, while one autistic may prefer pressure, wearing weighted clothing, or prefer to be hugged tightly, another autistic may be avoidant to touch altogether and may prefer loose-fitting clothing. Another common sign of this would be somebody who does not like tags at all, or the seams of clothing such as socks. For me, I have to have the tags torn out of my shirts, or find tagless shirts. And the seams of socks, when I was a child, they irritated me to no end. So I actually had to put my socks on only part of the way, enough for it to cover my foot. I would often wear tube socks. And then I would fold the toe portion of the sock up over my foot, allowing for a little bit more room for me to wiggle my toes to where it wasn't so tight, and then put the shoe on over my socks like that. And it would adjust throughout the day, so I'd have to take my shoe off and fix it. But also now in adulthood, my socks, if I pull them all the way on, it feels like a great deal of pressure against the tips of my toes, and it's very uncomfortable to the point of almost painful. So I still have to do that, pulling my socks, tube socks specifically, only halfway on, enough to where it covers my foot and ankle, and then leaving the toe part hanging and folding it up over the top of my foot to put my shoes on. So the symptoms must be present in the early developmental period, which is, as I said earlier, it has to be present in childhood. And as I stated, oftentimes these traits won't be present until a traumatic event happens, such as the infant being given a shot. But they may not become fully manifest until social demands exceed limited capacities, or may be masked by learned strategies in later life. This kind of corroborates what I was saying about the trauma. The trauma is a demand, which causes the traits to fully manifest. Now, this doesn't happen with all autistics, but those who need a lot of support needs oftentimes are accompanied with an intellectual disability as well. That is when our autistic traits fully manifest in childhood. Why a lot of people say that vaccines cause autism is because they actually manifest after that traumatic event of getting a shot. The symptoms cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of or current functioning. These disturbances are not better explained by intellectual developmental disorder, intellectual disability, or global developmental delay. Intellectual developmental disorder and autism spectrum disorder frequently co-occur to make comorbid diagnoses of autism spectrum disorder and intellectual developmental disorder. Social communication should be below that expected for general developmental level. So this really contradicts the Lancet's definition of profound autism. Because according to the Lancet, if you recall, autism, at least in this case, profound autism, as they say, is the exact same thing as an intellectual developmental disorder. But they are completely separate and unique disabilities. They can co-occur, but they are separate. There really is no such thing as profound autism. Specify current severity based on social communication impairments and restricted repetitive patterns of behavior, such as requiring very substantial support, requiring substantial support, requiring support. This would be low support, moderate support, or high support. What they mean by this is somebody can require support in restrictive repetitive behaviors, but also then require very substantial support in social communication, or vice versa. And oftentimes these aren't constricted to once you're diagnosed, that's all you are. Most of the time, as stated earlier, autistics will move between support levels throughout the day, throughout the week, throughout their lives. It's not stationary. Once you're diagnosed with requiring substantial support needs or requiring support, you're not stuck in that position. You will move between them on a regular basis, especially when it comes to meltdowns, overstimulation, shutdowns, stuff like that. An autistic individual can wake up one morning and be very low support needs, or as stated in the DSM, requiring support. But then by the end of the day, because of the stressors of the day, because of overstimulation, essentially spoon theory for lack of a better term, they may end up ending the day requiring very substantial support or high support. So it does fluctuate. It also needs to specify if with or without accompanying intellectual impairment, with or without accompanying language impairment, associated with a known genetic or other medical condition or environmental factor, or with catatonia. So as you can see here, the next couple slides are going to go into the co-occurring conditions. The first of these is ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. It's no longer listed as Attention Deficit Disorder or ADD. But with the release of the DSM-5, it was changed to attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And it's very common for autistics to also have ADHD and vice versa. Between 50 to 70% co-occurrence. I believe it's something like 80% of autistics also meet criteria to receive an ADHD diagnosis, and about 40% of people with ADHD meet criteria for an autism diagnosis. Around 84% of autistics experience a great deal of anxiety, such as generalized anxiety disorder, separation anxiety, social anxiety, phobias, and obsessive compulsive disorders. About 26% of the autistic population are impacted by depression, compared to the 7% of the general population, according to the CDC. About 35% of autistics also experience seizures and epilepsy, compared to the general population. Gastrointestinal problems are also common among autistics. Neurodivergence in general. This can be abdominal pain, chronic constipation, colitis, diarrhea, constant flatulence, or maybe not constant flatulence, but frequent flatulence, gastroesophageal reflux disease, and irritable bowel syndrome. Metabolic disorders, such as mitochondrial disease, which affects 7% of the autistic community. These impact and disrupt metabolic functions, such as how the body processes and uses proteins, fats, and carbs. The majority of autistics also experience sleep disorders, between 50 and 80%. This could be difficulty falling asleep, difficulty staying asleep, night waking, waking too early, poor sleep quality, sleepwalking, sleep talking, stuff like that. About 33% of autistics also have a learning disability. This could be something like dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, or another learning disability. About 48% of adult autistics meet criteria for at least one personality disorder diagnosis. This is most commonly the cluster B personality disorders, such as borderline personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, and narcissistic personality disorder. And that's often due to the trauma of childhood, of not being diagnosed autistic, of being bullied, of essentially being rejected by your peers, and oftentimes even your family. How many of us have heard, why can't you be more like your brother? Why can't you be more like your sister? Why can't you just be normal? I wish you would do this. I wish you would do that. That is traumatic for an autistic child. Other co-occurring conditions are sensory processing disorder, which affects about 90% of autistics. Avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, commonly called ARFID, affects about 11% of the autistic community. Now, when it comes to ARFID, a lot of us have found that protein shakes are a good equivalent, since many ARFID autistics are very picky eaters. And when it comes to ARFID, it doesn't matter how hungry the individual is. If it's something that has the wrong texture, taste, or whatever the case may be, they will not eat it. They would rather starve than eat it. 10% experience POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. What this generally is, from my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of symptoms of this could be stuff like growing pains are very common. I saw a video the other day saying that growing pains aren't actually common among the general population. That it's generally a sign of POTS. Also, when you stand up too fast, you get lightheaded, sometimes dizzy, maybe you black out for a split second. Those are also symptoms of POTS as well. Between 0.7 and 36% of the autistic population experience substance use disorders. And the problem with this is that because of the co-occurrence of autism and substance use disorder, many of the commonly forced therapies do not work because many autistics are avoidant of social situations. Maybe they don't like talking in group settings. Maybe they don't like being perceived. And groups are a big part of substance use treatment, especially if they're required by law. So in many cases, if an autistic also experiences a substance use disorder, chances are it may seem like they're not serious about getting clean, or they're not serious about getting sober, or they just don't want to participate. It's not that they don't want to, it's that they physically can't. About 8% of autistic adults, compared to 10% of the general population, end up developing dementia. And that increases once you're over the age of 64 for an autistic individual to about 35%. Something else, 18.9% of autistics experience synesthesia. This could be seeing sounds, smelling colors, tasting colors, stuff like that. For me, I have time-space synesthesia. I perceive time as a spiral going counterclockwise upwards. So the present, where I'm at right now, I'm on the top spiral. And if you were to flatten that out, it would look like a clock. But it wouldn't be as you might expect. For me, January would be 2, February would be 1, and March would be 12. From what I've gathered, I think this might be because I was born in the month of March, and so that my mind perceives that as 0 hour. So that is how I perceive time. Interoception, the ability to understand or perceive internal body sensations, affects about 98% of autistics. Prosopagnosia, essentially face blindness, affects 30% or 36% of the population of autistics. And what this is, from my understanding, I've spoken to a couple autistics who experience face blindness. They see the eyes, the nose, the hair, and the mouth, but they can't actually make out the distinct features of the human face. Like, they can't tell one face apart from the next. They can generally understand male versus female, and generally how they tell people apart is based on clothing. Also, 2 out of 5 studies found higher prevalence in autistics for time blindness. 3 out of 5 found no difference, though. Essentially, what time blindness is, many people often say time blindness is just a reason for people to be late, an excuse or whatever. What it actually is miscalculating the amount of time it's going to take to do something. I often call this waiting brain. For most of us with time blindness, we will show up to appointments extremely early. For me, I generally arrive to an appointment, to a class, whatever the case may be, between 30 minutes to an hour early, just in case I run into trouble, because I can't really judge accurately how long it's going to take to get somewhere. Even if I've been there a million times before, it's difficult for me to comprehend that. So I do generally leave quite a bit early, and this also allows me time to adjust, to go from waiting mode or go from relaxation mode to waiting mode to active mode. That change between relaxation, waiting, and active is very harsh for me. If I show up somewhere right on time, I feel like I'm running late. I have no time to actually adjust. So I still feel like I'm rushing, even once I'm already in the meeting, in the appointment, whatever the case may be. For others, also, when I owned my lawn care business, I would often misjudge how long it would take me to clean a yard. And I would often undercut it, thinking it wouldn't take me quite that long. But in reality, it would take me 3 times as long. That is time blindness. Alexithymia is limited understanding of emotions, and this affects about 49% of the autistic community. So we may understand the basic emotions, happy, sad, angry, but when it comes to all the other ones, depression, agitation, stuff like that, we can't quite pinpoint it. We don't quite understand what we're experiencing. So that does it for this first video lecture on Autism 101. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. I will have more videos in the future. It does take me some time to produce these because I do have to do all the research, because I want to make sure and give you guys all the references to back up my information as possible. Like I said, this is an academic level presentation. So I want to make sure that all my facts are correct. All the information isn't just opinions. It's not just my observations, but it's actually backed up by research. So as you see here, I've got about 3 pages worth of references just for this 1 hour, less than 1 hour, 50-minute presentation, which it may end up being cut down once I go into editing on this to cut out some of the extra noise and dead air and stuff. But just for this presentation, 3 pages worth of references. So this is the quality of video you'll get for this series, Autism 101. And depending on how well this does, I may go into further studies, advanced autism lectures, stuff like that, talking about neuro-affirming therapy. Who knows? We'll see how this goes. If there's a video you would like to see me make a lecture on, feel free to let me know in the comments below. And remember, everyone, just because an autistic person is different doesn't mean they're less. The only normal people are the ones you don't know very well.